who represented the Russian space organizations when the basic contracts to realize the International Space Station were negotiated. Please help me in welcoming Mike Suffredini and Jeff Manber to the stage.
All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Jeff and I find ourselves in this position that's not great. First of all, you had a panel before us that was outstanding. Quite a bit of intellect on the stage at one time. And so then you put us up here. And as Tim Parsons said, and I'm afraid we fit this category of pale, male, and stale, I'm a little worried about having now to face you after that conversation. And then to add insult to injury, right after this is the wine, so I'm afraid everybody's going to start, throwing tomatoes at us in a bit. So we'll walk through this quickly. But what we thought we'd try to do with you today is talk a little bit about the way we see the future. And from our perspective, it is a bright future. We wanted to talk a little bit about where we are today, where we're going, why we think the future is bright. And so we'll step through some charts pretty quickly, and then after we're done that, we'll take questions from the floor as long as you'll have us. So the U.S. government, in fact, a number of governments around the world have said that once ISS is done, we're going to basically cede low Earth orbit to commercial. Or said differently, they really don't have the money to operate a space station, low Earth orbit, and do exploration. And they desperately want to do exploration. And so what they would like to see us do, all of us here in this room, is take that next step. So we're trying to go from where we are today to where? Now, some of you have seen this chart before, but basically it's just what do you believe is our future? And many of us believe that platforms in low Earth orbit that do a number of things, not just satellites specific to a specific purpose, will be in low Earth orbit. Industry will be in low Earth orbit. Stations specific to that will be in low Earth orbit. Advertising, commercialization will come with that. Stations that do research specifically just for types of research could be in low Earth orbit. So the growth is there. The question is when. Of course, these two gentlemen you recognize, we think it's appropriate to quote them. They're both very experienced in their fields. Jeff has been very vocal about the fact that he thinks manufacturing in low Earth orbit is a very big deal, and it's where we're going in the future. He talks a lot about we don't need to be bringing everything we need in low Earth orbit, we need to build it in low Earth orbit. And Bob, of course, is owns a hotel chain amongst a lot of other real estate, and he's been very open about his desire to have a hotel in space. So how do we get there? That's the question. And Jeff and I will talk about our different perspectives about that. So I'll go first, and then Jeff will go through his thoughts as well. So to confuse things, I put this name up here, Axiom Space. The owner of SGT, who I work for today, and I are going together to co called Axiom Space LLC. And from that, we intend to work on a low Earth orbit platform to follow the International Space Station. And so today I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I'm going from a NASA guy, an industry that supports NASA, to an entrepreneur. And it's fascinating, and I'm making the transition now. I'm not there yet. And it's an interesting world to be in. So you go from the NASA side. Now, keep in mind, some of the NASA folks are in the room, or some of the bigger aerospace companies. This isn't meant to be a negative thing. This is just the pressures that we feel. So when you work for NASA, the number one thing is to keep the crew safe. This is human space flight. Losing a crew is not acceptable. And that's the mindset in everything you do. Of course, we had to build and operate the station. We had to protect the station itself. It's a very valuable asset, estimated about $100 billion, depending on who you talk to. And then we have to utilize processes that have grown out of 50 plus years of space flight. And quite a bit's been learned there. It shouldn't be thought of as a negative, but what we didn't figure out to do, and I hope we will over time as an agency, is figure out how to make those processes efficient, figure out which ones you really have to do and which ones you don't have to worry about anymore. We had kind of a cannot fail culture, and that really That's not so much in the current station program as we know it today, but it was steeped in the fact that we had shuttle flights, and every shuttle flight had 7 humans on board, and every shuttle flight cost about $500 million every time it flew. And so you didn't want to put an experiment on board and have it fail. That seemed like a waste of a precious asset. So you had this thought process. So on top of all the safety requirements we had other requirements that tried to make sure that whatever you were flying to orbit wasn't going to fail, which is a great thing from an experimenter standpoint, all the way to the point we figure out how much time and money it costs you to try to make sure that's the case, and it didn't always work. We had to manage within budgets, which in and of itself is not a big thing until you figure out that sometimes you don't even know what your budget is until halfway through your year. And if you lose $1.5 million, $150 million, halfway through the year, it's a pretty big impact. And that was always on the front of our minds. Of course, the ISS had international partners. That's an interesting challenge. Now you have 15 countries with a similar need, but diverse needs as well, and somehow you have to manage all that. You have to react to the administration and Congress, and of course we all know what that's like. And this support utilization and commercial growth is purposefully towards the end of the chart, because once you worry about all these other things, we finally got to start thinking about utilization and commercial use of the platform. And of course, always keep the crew safe. Of course, I like this picture because it's a fascinating picture, having grown up in space station and helped make that happen. It's a beautiful spacecraft that can do amazing things, and it was great for its purpose, but it's expensive to operate, and we need to figure out how to get to orbit in a more efficient way. So as an entrepreneur, I have other pressures that are a little bit different. You still have to be safe, by the way, because losing a crew, nothing kills your market more than losing a crew. And so you still have to be safe, but you do this within the framework of being able to make money, have a value proposition that people are interested in. You got to be efficient. You need to use the latest technologies. Brand recognition is a huge thing. You need to figure out how to separate yourself from the competition, particularly where we're headed. There's not going to be a lot of business early on, and so 2 or 3 space stations in low Earth orbit probably aren't going to be able to support themselves. So you have to figure out how to separate yourself from your competition. You need to be viewed as professional and technically capable, and you need to be viewed as safe to fly with. This is sort of specific to human spaceflight. So what I find is I'm sort of a microcosm of what this whole room represents, really. Because what you're trying to do is take the best of what has been learned over 50 plus years of spaceflight, the lion's share of which has been done by the government, and mix with that where the industry is today and is trying to go. You need to have more of an entrepreneurial spirit. You need to figure out how to do things more efficiently, but still be safe, like I talked about. And if you find that intersection, you end up with a very good product. Now, you take that and you take market assessments, and you pick a market assessment you want. We had this one done, and I left the names off so we didn't debate what the products were and whether that was a good assessment or not. But basically it says there's tens of billions of dollars worth of a market in low Earth orbit. And so it is an attractive place to go. So when you take all that, my vision is, and I have a very, very positive view of where we're going, is our future could look something like that. So that's where I think we're headed here in the next few years. And so with that, I think I'll leave it to Jeff.
Is it going to be called the Suffredini 1?
It's going to be called whatever the highest investor
Right.
is willing to give for.
Okay. So first off, I want to thank folks for inviting us and the incredible job that everybody's doing to make this conference with the energy and the diversity that we see. It really speaks well to the whole community. I want to just make a couple of quick comments about my personal journey at NanoRacks. We started NanoRacks a little over 6 years ago with the novel concept of commercially utilizing the space station. And, everybody said it's one thing, Jeff, you're up in Washington. You really got to get to know those Johnson Space Center people, and that's a whole different breed. And they're not going to like you. They're not going to like people like you. And the worst of them all is this guy named Mike Suffredini, who they don't even say his name. He's just Suff, okay? And everything is Suff says this, and Suff's going to do this. And they never know what he's really going to do, but it's like Suff said this. And I begin meeting with Suff, and, we're telling him what we're doing, and he's a little suspicious of me at first or at second or third. And then slowly, when we ran into the inevitable challenges of working with NASA and the bureaucracy and their concerns and the crew and the lessons that they took away from the shuttle accidents, I found that Suff was a person who would listen and direct the program to work with NanoRacks. And over time, he became a strong ally of commercialization. And I thought this was pretty good until one day he says, I'm going out in the world and I may just compete against you. So it's be very careful what you preach to the government officials. But on a positive note, I want to say that not only is this conference a reflection and a mirror of where we're going in the industry, and I say this sincerely, the fact that the head of space station for the United States is now pursuing a commercial space station platform is tremendous affirmation for where we are in the industry. And Mike may not know this, but a lot of the folks in this room and these type of conferences created the foundation for him to do what he's doing today. So I just think it's great that you're here, and it's a great marriage of the industry. So, yeah. So, at NanoRacks, we take a slightly different view. We're saying now, because we're steeped in, we're small, but we're a space operational company. We've flown over 350 payloads to the station in 6 years. And for us, we see a tremendous value in utilizing what's up there already. And we just think it's such a shame that we take things like the cargo ships and we fill them with cargo, take them to the space station, and we empty them. We then fill them with garbage and trash, and we burn them up. And we think that's kind of silly. So what we're looking for, we really like that NASA and people like Suff and Bill Gerstenmaier are saying, this is the last space station the government's going to own. So we're working on a philosophy of stepping stones. And we want to prove to the market, to the U.S. government, and to ourselves that we can operate commercial real estate. And so we just signed a Space Act agreement with NASA a couple Mondays ago, and in part it addresses repurposing the cargo vehicles. And in fact, it was Mike who said to me about a year ago, 2 years ago, could you really do things differently if you were, had your own piece of real estate not connected to the ISS? And I'm like, hell yeah. So, and it's not the obvious. I mean, sure, you have media and your branding that Mike was just talking about, and Bigelow talks about, but we've also been talking to folks in the government and research, and there are a number of markets that we could sustain from commercial real estate in space, separate either from the NASA system, the international partners, manned crew. You can really get into spending the next few years showing commercial utilization of space as an adjunct of the ISS, but not connected to it. And let me say that in all this discussion of the next era of private space stations, it would not have been possible without the International Space Station Program. We have a wonderful legal environment with the IGA. We have, we've learned a lot. And so, but we just see the next step for us is repurposing the vehicles. Oops. Okay, so I guess that's, oops, what did I screw up here? I don't know, I screwed it up. Okay, let's see. I don't know how to get it. Can we, okay, so I would, I think there was a couple more slides. We're working towards, thank you. We're working towards our own station, utilizing different parts. The airlock, we signed the Space Act agreement with NASA to do a commercial airlock. We see that will be on the International Space Station, and we see that also as the first part of our own space station program, because that airlock can leave the station at the proper time, and 4, 5, 6 years from now, and attached to a commercial piece of real estate. What I thought we would do in finishing off here, and knowing that for about 2 years I've been debating with Mike on where we're going and how we do it, I decided to put together a bunch of questions to ask him, Mr. Entrepreneur, former government official. So I decided to put some questions together, and these are the, and you see, still I have to call him Mr. Suffredini. You know, it's anyway. So. First question that would be really critical for all entrepreneurs, in my view, is to have a firm cutoff date for the ISS. And do you want to talk about that? It's a shame we opened mic.
Yeah, I think it would be good to have a firm cutoff date, but I think the industry needs ISS to stay in orbit as long as it reasonably can, so we can build the market. So if you ask me where I think the cutoff date is, I actually think it's beyond 24. I think the government is set that particularly because of the commercial industry that's showing interest, things like this conference showing the government officials that there's real interest and real work in this field, that if ISS staying in orbit longer helps grow this field so that we can establish ourselves in low Earth orbit, then I think the government will keep it in orbit a little bit longer. So I would like to know the cutoff date, but frankly, I don't want to hear 2024, so I hate to ask.
So I think with a great deal of nervousness, I support 2024 because we're either going to do it or we're not going to do it. And I've worked too long with the government, and if you don't give, I mean, it'll just keep going. It's like the steam locomotive commission or something. They'll just keep going. So I do support a firm date, and let's move on. I think the United States has liquidity in the private sector. It has the smarts, the know-how to run commercial platforms. But so the other question that Suffredini and Suff and myself and others have been debating over and over is, whatever date it is, how do we handle the transition period? We've never experienced this before, where you're saying we're going to leave it, you know, operational space, and we're going to turn it over to a bunch of companies. And so how do you handle that? And I'd really appreciate you sharing some of your thoughts on that.
You tell me.
Well, I mean, I don't want the government as a competitor. I want the government as a customer. So it seems to me that you'd shut it down service by service, so that if suddenly someone comes along and they're doing Earth observation, then you would say, "Oh, thank you." Then NASA would make the decision, as of this date, the service is available in the commercial sector, we will stop. And so what I would envision is a slow transition by NASA from operating its own services and research and becoming a customer when it's available on the platform. What say you?
Right. So I don't disagree with that, but what I think is it's hard to call them industries in my mind, but as specific users have commercial opportunities to do what they want to do, I think NASA needs to step away. Now, how NASA steps away is a whole discussion in its own right. But I think we have to keep in mind that as the successes become obvious to folks, they start to think about other utilizations. I think other things start to grow. And so I think it's very important for us to transition and be willing to transition each item as it gets to the point where there's a commercial opportunity. I think the hard part is to figure out how to transition some of those things that need a platform in low Earth orbit to continue while the ISS is still around. I think that's a big challenge. And frankly, I don't know how to do it. My personal thought process is that you bring your whatever station you build starts off as a module at ISS, and the rest of the station comes and gets it. And that's certainly our approach.
One of the strongest discussions we used to have is Mike has this allergy to NASA as customer. He thinks it's kind of people tricking him when he was in the government. And so I'd say, well, I'd like you as a customer. And he'd say, not as an anchor tenant. Okay, so I agree that for one, I've been through a lot of these attempts before to do commercialization, and NASA and the government as an anchor tenant, it doesn't work. I agree on that, because it makes you become lazy. You have the government. They're always an inefficient buyer. There's just no way around it. And you think you can get along and you don't become lean and mean, which is necessary to survive in the commercial sector. So I share that we do not want NASA or the U.S. government or ESA or JAXA as anchor tenants. But I do want them as customers, the government.
Right. So, I think, well, I don't think, when we worked on our business case, we made the assumption about what the U.S. and the other partners spend on research and manufacturing, and we made assumptions on what they would need to test exploration systems and to do human research. And we just factor that into our business case because we believe they'll be there. If you go ask any NASA official that's paying attention to the Q cards, whether or not they're willing to become a tenant in low Earth orbit, they would probably tell you no. And they don't really mean that. It's really more of they want more than anything, and I agree with them on this, that commercial takes over low Earth orbit. And as Jeff said, if you become an anchor tenant, then the next step to saying yes, when a NASA official says, yes, I need low Earth orbit, next thing you know, some congressional person or OSTP or administration official is going to start telling the agency to spend multiple millions of dollars to help build said platform so that they can use it, and we'll be in the worst possible spot because the advantage to having industry try to do something that they have to make money at makes them work very, very hard to find the customers and nurture the customers. And that will be lost on us all if the government comes in and says, I'll be an anchor tenant, and then starts paying the first $50 million. Next thing you know, they're paying for the launch. And next thing you know, they're covering the cost because it's not making money because there's no other customer besides the government. So, I agree with Jeff. I agree with where the agency's trying to go and how it's painting the picture. But the fact is, governments, particularly governments that are going to explore beyond low Earth orbit, have to have a low Earth orbit platform. It's just that simple. Even if they chose to stop all fundamental research, they have to test the systems, the design of the systems that they want to put in spacecraft to go to Mars and back. On ISS today, we have life support systems that still aren't very reliable. We're constantly working on them, and that's no fault of anybody's. It's a very difficult process. Processing urine and turning it into potable water is a very difficult thing to do, and you really can't test it on the ground. You have to be in a microgravity environment when you're talking about fluids that have multiple phases in them and things of this nature. So there will always be a need for a low Earth orbit platform. So how they talk about it's a little different today, but I think that's the appropriate thought process, that we need the government to not spend money on a low Earth orbit platform, so commercial will work very, very hard to get the customer base they need to support a commercial platform in low Earth orbit.
One of the exciting things for me is when you look 5 to 10 years, no later than 10 years out, I believe you're really looking at a multiplicity of commercial space stations in orbit. You're going to have some that are manned. Look, in a few years, we're going to have 5 probably human-rated transportation systems to and from space. You'll have the Russians. You'll have Boeing. You'll have SpaceX. You'll have the Chinese. You'll probably have Blue Origin. Okay, so you're going to have a multiplicity of opportunities to get to and from space. So you're going to have a marketplace. You're going to have hotels. You're going to have non-professionals. You're going to have professionals, as Mike was just saying, wanting to test things out before they go to deep space. You're going to have unmanned. Really our focus at NanoRacks is looking at how you take advanced technology and put it on unmanned platforms. So in my view, as you move out and you begin to get commercial, the inefficiencies of the ISS will become more and more apparent, especially as you phase out. You don't compete against the private sector. And so to me, I think there's room for more than, I'd say about 3. A couple of hotel, another manned, a couple unmanned in this next decade. So I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think we will get to the point you said, and I think we're only quibbling about how long it'll take us to get there. I think when ISS is deorbited It'll be, I think, a great thing if we have one or two stations. But I think our future is, as you said, multiple stations. I think most people already know this, but man-tended vehicles are a lot less expensive to operate. Vehicles that are specific to a certain type of research can be run more efficiently to focus on that kind of research. If you couldn't put them in co-orbit so that you can service multiple with one crew, that'd be more efficient. So I do see multiple platforms in the future. But I think when ISS goes, we're still going to be looking at a platform that does multiple things as the market continues to grow. I hope the market will support more than one or two, but it's just, again, I think it's timing.
I have one surprise question for Mike that I didn't put on the slide, but before I do, I just want to say that sometimes people ask me, how real is the threat of the Chinese? And I sure hope they're real, and I welcome competition in a commercial way. I'm not talking about strategic, military. I'm not talking about symbolism. I'm just talking about having other platforms in space. I just welcome as much real estate as we get in space. I think, if I may speak from an American perspective here, it makes us smarter. And in this society, in the West, it makes us smarter. And so I just throwing out just a personal comment that sometimes I study, I spend a couple hours on a Sunday studying very carefully, what the Chinese pronouncements are, their quotes, what they're saying, and that's really good. It forces us to stay focused on utilization. So it's just a general comment. But we just got signal. We have just a few minutes left, and I guess I didn't want you to really think about this, so I didn't put it in the slide. But I wonder if you could share with us the major surprise that you have encountered now being on the right side of the industry.
On the right side of the industry.
Correct. It's not a political statement, Mike. It's the correct side of the industry, the good side.
Well, I got to tell you, and this maybe it's not a huge surprise. It's a surprise to me how big of a factor it is, but I always knew this existed. When you work for the government, you have a lot of people that are helping you. And by a lot of people, I just don't mean the thousands of people that are doing the job of helping you build and operate a spacecraft like the space station. You have IGs and GAOs and government officials and all kinds of folks who clearly are a lot smarter than you are to how do you operate. And then you have laws, which we all have to live by. And then you have policy. And everything needs to be, I shouldn't say it quite like that. Depending on the administrations, sometimes it can be a very long process to get anything done because the legal guys have to see it, the procurement guys have to see it, the policy guys have to see it. It just gets through this long, drawn-out process. And on the commercial side, you really just have to obey the laws. If it makes sense, you got to obey the laws. Now we have lawyers too, and the lawyers keep us out of trouble when we make agreements and that perhaps have some holes in them, and you have to watch out for that. But that's a much less drawn-out process than what you have on the government side. So there's an agility on the commercial side that is phenomenal, and I didn't realize how agile you were until I came on this side and realized that I can decide things and go do things. And the only thing I have to back up and say to myself, is this really the right thing to do? Because we're not doing, 20 studies. We don't have the legal guys and policy guys and all these folks lined up. You got to think about yourself. You got to consult with the folks that you work with. And then you go off and step out and go try to make it happen. And you accept that sometimes you're right and sometimes you're not, but you're moving forward. You're always moving forward. You learn when your step isn't quite right, you react to that and you move on. And it's a wonderful place to be. I really like that aspect of being on the other side, as Jeff said.
One quick final comment from me is now the new head of station, Kirk Scheinman, once in a while asks me a question. Boy, am I careful on how I answer. So you never know who's going to end up in the private sector. So, but anyway, so I think that's about it. Do we take questions? Or
okay, so we can take some questions. Apparently, he said one, but
Okay.
I mean, it's your risk because you're between the wine and the people.
So I worked with Tony Butine and Kevin Wolf keeping that life support system alive. And you're absolutely right. There was a reverence and an awe for Suffredini. We're all a little afraid of him sometimes. So I'm happy to see you guys, in the banter. So a lot of times people criticize NASA for, doing this or that. But, we're all aware that the government directs NASA with these policies and laws that you're talking about. So what is the role of your choice and your culture when it's the legislators who are telling you guys what to do?
Well, if you're fortunate, and generally speaking, the process works this way, you can influence the thought process before it becomes gospel. And that was really when we brought the Russians to the International Space Station. I mean, if you looked around, the worker bees thought, my God. And really, they were thinking, my God, because we had to modify the shuttle so it could launch to 51.6. That was the big my God from the worker standpoint. But it was a policy decision that was worked with the administration. It was worked with the NASA leadership. It was worked with the Congress, obviously. And so you do kind of get to affect your life. And ultimately, you're responsible for the designs that you build and how you build them and get them to orbit. So it's you do have quite a bit of control in your world, but you got your hands tied pretty tight too. The biggest thing is nothing happens fast in the government. Nothing happens fast in the government. Things happen in the government, but they just are incredibly slow.
We just got a hard stop, so argue with him. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you guys very much. And so what they would like to see us do, all of us here in this room, is take that next step. So we're trying to go from where we are today to where? Now, some of you have seen this chart before, but basically it's just what do you believe is our future? And many of us believe that platforms in low Earth orbit that do a number of things, not just satellites specific to a specific purpose, will be in low Earth orbit. Industry will be in low Earth orbit. Stations specific to that will be in low Earth orbit. Advertising, commercialization will come with that. Stations that do research specifically just for types of research could be in low Earth orbit. So the growth is there. The question is when. Of course, these two gentlemen you recognize. We think it's appropriate to quote them. They're both very experienced in their fields. Jeff has been very vocal about the fact that he thinks manufacturing in low Earth orbit is a very big deal, and it's where we're going in the future. He talks a lot about we don't need to be bringing everything we need in low Earth orbit. We need to build it in low Earth orbit. And Bob, of course, owns a hotel chain amongst a lot of other real estate, and he's been very open about his desire to have a hotel in space. So how do we get there? That's the question. And Jeff and I will talk about our different perspectives about that. So I'll go first, and then Jeff will go through his thoughts as well. So to confuse things, I'll do this quickly, but what we thought we'd try to do with you today is talk a little bit about the way we see the future. And from our perspective, it is a bright future. We wanted to talk a little bit about where we are today, where we're going, why we think the future is bright. And so we'll step through some charts pretty quickly, and then after we're done that, we'll take questions from the floors as long as you'll have us. So the U.S. government, in fact, a number of governments around the world have said that once ISS is done, we're going to basically cede low Earth orbit to commercial. Or said differently, they really don't have the money to operate a space station in low Earth orbit and do exploration, and they desperately want to do exploration.
You represented the Russian space organizations when the basic contracts to realize the International Space Station were negotiated. Please help me in welcoming Mike Suffredini and Jeff Manber to the stage.
All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Jeff and I find ourselves in this position that's not great. First of all, you had a panel before us that was outstanding. Quite a bit of intellect on the stage at one time. And so then you put us up here. And as Tim Parsons said, and I'm afraid we fit this category of pale, male, and stale, I'm a little worried about having now to face you after that conversation. And then to add insult to injury, right after this is the wine, so I'm afraid everybody's going to start, throwing tomatoes at us in a bit. So we'll walk this name up here, Axiom Space. The owner of SGT, who I work for today, and I are going together to called Axiom Space LLC. And from that, we intend to work on a low Earth orbit platform to follow the International Space Station. And so today I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I'm going from a NASA guy, an industry that supports NASA, to an entrepreneur. And it's fascinating, and I'm making the transition now. I'm not there yet. And it's an interesting world to be in. So you go from the NASA side. Now, keep in mind, some of the NASA folks are in the room, or some of the bigger aerospace companies. This isn't